Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, May the 12th, Immigration Crackdown Day, and not for the first time. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gets the briefings and the opposite ones and mugs up for the day ahead in British politics, delivered in under 20 minutes in time for your commute or your coffee break.
Things have been moving incredibly fast-paced at home and abroad since we last spoke, and Keir Starmer made a surprise visit to Kyiv. President Putin offered to meet President Zelenskyy, but he wants a truce first, so will it happen this week? We saw the worst fighting breaking out between India and Pakistan in over half a decade, only to see Donald Trump intervene to demand a truce there. That's particularly upset the Indians. And the US and China are having trade talks. Didn't see that coming last week. And they both claim that they've made some progress, but haven't explained exactly how. What a weekend.
What a weekend, indeed. And particularly, I think, for those of us who are greatly concerned about the future of Ukraine, Sam, and what is going to happen to end that war and on what terms. And I've just been keeping an eye on the emergence of what you could call the Weimar Triangle, but sometimes it turns up as the Weimar Quadrangle, which does involve Britain, and that is France, Germany, Poland, and the UK, really pushing together now for higher sanctions on the European side if President Putin doesn't sign up to that 30-day ceasefire. And I don't think it's going to surprise you on a Monday morning to hear that President Putin isn't playing the straightest of bats in response. He's indicating to President Zelenskyy of Ukraine he's prepared to meet in Turkey on Thursday, but only if the root causes of the conflict, etc., are addressed, rather than agreeing to simply stop the fighting, which is what he's been asked to do. And I think it's a really interesting point for the Western response, which we might dig into a little bit later on.
So those peace talks or not are actually really high up on Downing Street's grid, I understand, for the back end of this week. But today is about migration, specifically immigration and the white paper that's being released at 9:30 this morning. In fact, this is a week that's going to be bookended by migration. So this morning, to launch that immigration white paper, there's a press conference in Downing Street at the god-awful hour of 8:30 a.m, and I'll be there for you, Anne. So we'll hear from Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper then. But then just to fast forward, at the back end of the week, Keir Starmer is going to be in Albania on Thursday talking about illegal migration with Edi Rama. He's the Albanian Prime Minister. And then on Friday, he'll come together with other EU leaders at that thing called the European Political Community. That's the gathering that's European leaders, but not part of the EU, set up by President Macron. And that's where illegal migration is also on the agenda, but they expect Ukraine to dominate. To be honest, yesterday's exchanges between President Putin and President Zelenskyy means that this week, I think, is going to feel quite fast-paced on the international scene and quite unpredictable. And they know that, I think, in number 10. And at any moment, the government's agenda could be sort of diverted by what goes on over there. And all of this is against the backdrop. All this is a lot of engagement with EU leaders. We saw it on Saturday in Kyiv, where not only was Keir Starmer with President Zelenskyy, but also President Macron, and he's meeting some of these characters at the end of the week. All of this comes before the big EU reset summit, which is a week today. So expect EU arguments to bleed all the way through the week.
Doesn't time fly when the world is in such chaos? Migration and war definitely shaping the week then for Keir Starmer. Most decisive one, I'd suggest, in his tenure, because it is the moment when he grapples with a subject that helped kill off his predecessor's election hopes and worries Labour greatly now, Sam. And that is, of course, the scale of immigration and asylum measures and how they work out in practice, or how they don't, and lead to uncontrolled migration there, particularly via the small boats on the southern coast. What do we know about the detail of the white paper, and what is going to happen to those net migration targets? Because they have bedeviled the Conservatives for so long. The need or perceived need to set them, the difficulty in then hitting them. How do we think Keir Starmer is going to go about that, given that nothing short of a very low, very hard target is going to answer the catcalls from reform on this subject?
That's right. Well, should we start off by talking about the big argument that the government's going to make, and then we'll come on to some of the specifics? Look, there is a tendency amongst us journalists to always like to present everything as new, and blink and you miss it, and you might think that the arguments being made by Keir Starmer are new ones. But actually, interestingly, Downing Street is at pains this morning to point out that what Keir Starmer is saying, the argument that Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper are making this morning, are in line with Keir Starmer's speech to the CBI in 2022. Now, that's when he first said that business would need to wean itself off the level of international labour that it had become dependent on to start training those UK workers rather than automatically looking overseas in order to plug those gaps. Now, what's different now? Keir Starmer's in government, and net migration numbers went through the roof in the period since he made that 2022 speech. You may remember last year, and there were some revisions to the ONS data so that net migration rose to a record high of a whopping 906,000 in the year to June 2023, and it stood at 728,000 in the year to June last year. So it will always feel about numbers, even if the government argues it's not entirely about numbers. This is an argument about net migration. One of the issues that's worrying the Home Office at the moment, who will get the most flack if they don't get numbers down substantially, that's the commitment from Yvette Cooper, is that actually the number of departures is slowing due to a myriad of factors, including people overstaying their visas. And so this number will prove sticky. There is a suggestion that privately, and this was also a bombshell line in the Times story on Saturday, that privately, allies of the Prime Minister have a figure of about 250,000 as a target that they would like to see us get to by the end of the Parliament. I think in public, everybody would throw their hands up in horror at there being anything like a target, because he's very, very specifically not a policy of the government. And Yvette Cooper was on the telly yesterday denying that there was any such target whatsoever, other than getting net migration down substantially. The argument they want to make is it's not about the numbers, it's about the composition, and that they're going to be tackling low-skill migration, particularly by coming after people in the social care sector. And that's where the big policy is today. That is that by the end of the year, from later this year, care providers will no longer be able to hire workers from overseas, and this is quite a big deal for a sector under pressure. And if there are gaps in the care sector, you can use people who've already come over here on a care visa, but perhaps their work has expired. But from later this year, a big change for the care sector, and they will no longer be able to hire in people from overseas to plug those gaps. Do we think that this is about symbolism, numbers, or it's just the most effective way by targeting an industry under pressure to actually make some meaningful difference?
All three. I mean, just unpacking a bit what you've said, as I would see it, it's going to be quite difficult, I think, to sustain a commitment, Sam, to tackle migration as strongly as Labour is now saying it wants to do. And of course, the reform surge is in the backdrop to that very firmly. Without that number and the fact that you can cite it from good sources of 200,000, without ever having that to put on the table, they're going to be asked absolutely everywhere they go, are you reducing net migration to 200,000 a year, or aren't you? Some crowing, I think, from the Conservatives on this, and you might think that's odd given the trouble they got themselves into on those massive numbers that you just cited. So wondering why, given that there's so much going on that should pull down the overall numbers, why not actually go for the low-hanging fruit and simply put a number out there? But I think we know the answer to that. They're very unconfident, then, given the sort of interagency chaos that often prevails in these matters, that they can hit it. So as you suggest, they're trying to talk about the composition of incomers and starting there with care workers. I mean, it is Also worth saying that while Morgan McSweeney has become very convinced and takes a very different view fundamentally in the Prime Minister's office from the classic position of the Treasury and the OBR, that in fiscal terms, immigrants to Britain are a net benefit. He's saying you do have to factor in much more for the additional strain on public infrastructure, on public services than the official forecasts presently rely on. But when you start to think about individual sectors, and care is certainly the one the government's chosen to lead on, a couple of things, you really are then banking on being able to find the available and willing British labour without people in a short time feeling that they've been shortchanged and that they're aging, in this case, often aging, not only aging, but mainly aging mum or dad or relative, didn't get the choice of carer because the government had kind of shut up shop on that one. And I'm sure we're going to see that repeated also when you come to other trades, builders, plumbers, all the other people where we know that we've tended to have an overhang of migrant labour. But this is certainly the direction of travel, as you point out.
Downing Street will be at pains this morning to reject any suggestion of a tension between Rachel Reeves and Yvette Cooper, although I know that they have been pulling in opposite directions over the last few weeks. I've had that a fairly convincing account of that recently. And the nub, the reason that they're in different pages is because they have different incentives, right? Cabinet ministers don't have blazing rows most of the time. All that happens when cabinet ministers disagree is that they are trying to represent their department that have sometimes, as in this case, diametrically opposite kind of, goals. So the number one goal for Rachel Reeves is to make sure that she fulfills her promises on the fiscal rules. This is the Fiscal Rules podcast, right? Listeners will only be still listening to us if they care about whether or not Rachel Reeves meets her sort of self-imposed borrowing targets in 4 years' time, not to have any borrowing to fund day-to-day spending, a target which she will only meet by the narrowest of margins. And what Yvette Cooper's doing today will make that harder, because every time you have more migration, the Office for Budget Responsibility scores a sort of win for Rachel Reeves and suggests that that's a boost to growth, and with it, greater tax revenue, and with that, you're closer to meeting your goal. And the reverse is true. When you cut net migration, you cut those forecasts, then the OBR scores that as a loss. Now, there's a big argument going on behind the scenes about whether the OBR does things correctly. Actually, note for the nerds, it's for the Treasury to authorise the OBR to do things differently in this case. So the question is, does Rachel Reeves really want to do that? Or is she sort of leaning on the OBR to try and make the case that even if it's an artificial boost to growth because of the wrong type of growth, because you're relying on migrant labour in order to plug gaps in the economy, that's okay. That's the argument she wants to make. But I think it does show part of this sort of package and this piece that you've seen. Fascinating that Yvette Cooper, I think, is one of the few cabinet ministers that is listened to, when she challenges Rachel Reeves. And in some ways, the heart of Downing Street slightly more sympathetic at the moment to the Yvette Cooper argument, in part because of what you were saying about the rise of reform and the fact that they're doing so well.
And they're going to need to keep Yvette Cooper broadly happy in Downing Street, aren't they, Sam? Because if you've got a Home Secretary who's going to be under immense pressure when this white paper goes into battle and beyond, of course, it's all going to blow back on her. Is it working out? Is it not? Did those numbers stack up? Are there problems? We haven't talked so much this morning. I'm sure we will in future about the changes to the asylum system. So I think she is a tough cookie, Yvette Cooper. I'm sure she's been asking for overt support. And at the same time, if, as we hear, some form of youth mobility scheme is going to have to be there next week for that big EU summit, it seems to be part of the price of entry for the UK. But as you and I both reflected from different sources, there's a lot of push and pull about how long it is and what it is. And is it really just a visa system, or is there also any danger of a lot of people overstaying, etc.? Well, if she's got to carry the can for that, Yvette Cooper, she's certainly going to want to have some backing in return. Can I just, my sense of humour is belatedly kicked in, and I just want to say that Sam Coates did give us an immortal line when he said this was a podcast that if you were listening to it, you were one of the people who cared passionately about Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules in 4 years' time. Listeners, don't worry. Even if you don't so much, we have other things to offer.
I don't. One mark of the... thank you for reassuring our listeners. One of the markers, I think, of just how strong Yvette Cooper is in government at the moment is there are lots of... I could go through the list of things that are going to announce today, but I don't think a list will be particularly exciting. But other than one of the very specifics is that there is going to be effectively a digital visa system for migrants coming in so that it's much easier to check whether you've overstayed, whether you've got the right to work, whether you're paying taxes, whether you have access to benefits and that kind of thing. Now, that goes very, very close to digital ID. And I just find this fascinating that Yvette Cooper's department have got come as, you know, one of the great arguments from Tony Blair about why you need a universal digital ID is to keep better track of migration. Now, the Home Office, now I don't think Yvette Cooper herself has been in favour of universal digital ID, but her department now has gone most of the way with migration, and migrants will be required to have a sort of digital footprint about their activity in the UK. And I just think as a starting point for a system, say one day there is a different Home Secretary, we now have an infrastructure that takes us quite a long way there. And I just think this argument is sort of evolving by stealth and hasn't gone away, however much prime ministers and others say we're not all going to have digital ID cards. I feel like part of the population is most of the way there, and that just makes it easier for it to go further.
When is an ID card not an ID card? I think it's going to end up in that kind of fine nuance, isn't it? What it's called, who has to carry it, and on what terms.
Now, should we just pivot quickly to where you think we are on Ukraine and Russia and the big picture of that? So important to Keir Starmer for his relations with Donald Trump and Britain's position in the world, really. What's going on?
I think the skinny version of this, Sam, is that we will know more on Thursday when that meeting is due to take place, agreed to on rather different terms on two sides, which is never a great start for a meeting. But anyway, between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Vladimir Putin in Turkey. And the gamesmanship is going right down to the wire on that. Zelenskyy, very emboldened, and this is very relevant to the UK because the UK, Germany, France, Poland are acting in concert on this threat to push very quickly for much bigger sanctions on Russia if Mr. Putin doesn't come to the table on a full 30-day ceasefire. Let's just bear that in mind. That's going to be the sort of bumper sticker on this event. Does it fly or does it not fly based on that? And Merz reassuring Kyiv and told this in a private conversation before it was announced to Keir Starmer, I gather, that he would up weapons deliveries by Germany to Ukraine, and he would keep secret what was in them, which has raised hopes in Kyiv of much bigger support and bigger weaponry there. So this is obviously all intended to get Bad Vlad to the table and to get him to say yes to that 30-day ceasefire. A bit of a muddled message from Donald Trump on that. He says he wants a full stop to the fighting, well, as does everybody, but he did not underline or even particularly support the 30 days, but everybody else does. I've been doing my morning watching brief of Kremlin communications, and Maria Zakharova, the steely, very blunt mouthpiece of the Kremlin, who has been saying on social posts and in broadcasts, there will be no ceasefire until the root causes of the conflict are resolved, which, of course, in Russia's mind, means getting rid of Zelenskyy and demilitarizing Ukraine. And neither of those are going to happen before Thursday, at least. So I think that I would read it as Russia playing cards very close to its chest, possibly as Zelenskyy has teased in a social post, finding a reason not to go to the talks or to go at the last minute in the hope of seizing some last minute advantage there. Keir Starmer, like the rest of us, will only find out on Thursday.
Thank you very much indeed for all of that. We've run out of time. We don't have time to discuss how Adrian Ramsey is going to stand for re-election of the Green co-leader with Ellie Chown's new name for British politics there, nor do we have time to talk about how Ed Davey on Thursday is going to be releasing a book called Why I Care. Those can come later. This is our 20-minute curtains coming down. So there just leaves for me to say I'm going to see you later, and I can run to Downing Street for this press conference. But otherwise, we will be back in 24 hours for Tuesday's Politics at Sam and Anne's.
And we'll see you from Downing Street, no doubt, and see you tomorrow.
See you then.
The first 100 days might be over, but President Trump is showing no signs of slowing down.
America will soon be greater than ever before.
So we're continuing to follow every twist and turn of this remarkable presidency.
And trying to make sense of what it all means for the US and for the rest of the world.
So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Malta Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Sky News Trump 100, wherever you get your podcasts.